So after I'm done up here talking, we're going to do something worth way more than any words I could possibly offer here today. We're going to sing We Shall Overcome. It's a fitting selection, I think, for this weekend as we, as a country, celebrate the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. We will sing it and lift every voice later to honor and uphold and hopefully meaningfully reflect on that legacy, the legacy of Dr. King and of the many civil rights leaders who held America accountable to her promise of freedom and equality for all. We Shall Overcome became the anthem for the civil rights movement at the Highlander Folk School, which is actually located not far from where I grew up in East Tennessee. The school had been adapting many folk songs in service of the civil rights movement, including this one. And it's said that when Dr. King came to speak at the school in 1957, Pete Seeger was there, and he led everyone in singing We Shall Overcome at some point during the event. As Dr. King and his companions drove off, he was reportedly humming the tune and said, "There's something about that song that haunts you." It haunts you. It's such an interesting choice of language there. It conjures up images of ghost, typically. But what it really means is to be persistently and disturbingly present. It's a song that gets into your being and it stays there. It persists in and insists on its promise, even against a backdrop of seeming impossibility. It reminds us of the spot deep in our hearts that still believes. The song would later feature prominently in Dr. King's speeches, most famously in the oft-quoted line, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It's the big cosmic view of justice that says, I may not see its fruition in my lifetime, but I'll tend to its potential while I've breath. I personally like the way Wendell Berry captures this idea. He says, invest in the millennium, plant sequoias, say that your crop is the forest that you did not plant, that you will not live to harvest. We shall overcome someday. An eye towards that kind of scale is how the Gospel of John begins. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being through him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. This is a big story going all the way back to in the beginning. And we're promised that the darkness does not overtake the light in that big story, even when the darkness feels very dark. That we can be the light, that we, as people of the light, shall overcome. It's one thing to read those words or hear the history of a song like We Shall Overcome, and quite another to locate ourselves along that big, long arc, to recognize ourselves as the ones capable of bending it. Which is why I think the Gospel of John goes from this grand cosmic prologue down to the granular level, people gathered together at a wedding. We're taken there to reveal the divine power God made manifest at Cana. The miracle performed here very simply is the transformation of water to wine, you could say, but its effects, to me, highlight the everyday miracles at work already at a gathering such as this: togetherness, community, fellowship, love, and joy. The quiet act of turning the water into wine allows these gifts to continue on. The celebration continues, we're told, undeterred by the threat of scarcity and met instead with God's great abundance. I call it a quiet act because the person in charge, we're told, has no clue what happened to bring about such abundance. nor does the bridegroom or presumably any of the guests at the wedding, aside from the disciples and Mary, and of course the servants who drew the water. But whether they know its source, that abundance reaches them all. God is always at work in our togetherness in ways seen and unseen. God of all time and every place is made known in the intimate places of our lives together, like this wedding. Our gathering together means something along that long moral arc. The light that overcomes the darkness was revealed at one such gathering, the first miracle of Jesus' ministry performed so that the party could go on. Now, it was through gatherings of folks that We Shall Overcome came into being. The Highlander was very intentional about its gatherings. It would bring together Black and white Americans to tell their stories, and more importantly, maybe to listen to one another. Its founder, Miles Horton, operated under the belief that, as he wrote, the people would find their identity not within themselves, but in relationship with others. It is from that relationship that the song emerged. It's an amalgamation of many bits and pieces, bits of European melodies and of the songs of enslaved peoples in America. A tenure as a labor movement song in the 1940s to what we now know, formed largely at the Highlander Folk School. It grew out of the people who needed it sung, sprang forth and emerged. Now, I was born in the 80s, and I grew up in a predominantly white community in Appalachia, so I don't have the lived experience of this song that some of you might. I did grow up familiar with it, though. Joan Baez and Pete Seeger were in the regular musical rotation at my household, so I heard their versions, and I also learned something of its significance in a historical sense. But it does change when you sing it with people, instead of just listen to it or learn about it. I first started singing it with others as a movement song at the memorial services held after every execution in the state at the Capitol Rotunda. A faithful group gathers there to pray for the end of all violence, to memorialize both the victims of crime and the one killed in our name the night before. They'll gather again next month on February 14th, barring miraculous legal intervention. This time it will be to memorialize James Ford, whose death warrant was signed last weekend, as well as Kimberly and Greg Malnery. These services at the Capitol, and I've been to far too many, they always end with "We shall overcome." And I recall realizing one day that among those gathered there was someone who had himself marched at Selma. And I remember the time we were singing it, and a construction worker at the Capitol walked by, and I noticed from a distance that he was singing along. He was mouthing the words along. And as he walked away, he lifted his fist in solidarity. Suddenly you realize this song has transformed for you. It's not the song of the history books or the recordings. It's the one you are adding your voice to, the one whose storied history you are joining, the one that lives and breathes and, dare I say, haunts. And it happens because you sing it together. By singing it with others, you start to believe in it, really believe in it. And so I think we can emphasize the supernatural dimensions of Jesus' miracles, I suppose. Water to wine, remarkable healings, raising Lazarus from the dead. But I think the seeming magic is always less the point than what these miracles say about relationship and justice. The miracles, signs, as John calls them, are almost incidental to questions of whom Jesus calls in, and how these miraculous acts point us towards ways of being that are fully within our reach, no superpowers required. Like in singing about the hope that haunts us, singing it into being. And one of the verses we'll sing is "We Are Not Afraid," which I want to end by giving special attention to. That one has its own story from the Highlander. The school was raided one night by vigilantes and police, and it was as they were hosting a youth choir, children, to be clear. These young people were watching a movie when it happened. Before the raid, the city shut off the lights so that when these men and their billy clubs came storming in, the children were surrounded by darkness. But the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overtake it. A 14-year-old girl named Jamila Jones, who had participated in the Montgomery bus boycotts 2 years prior as a mere 12-year-old, she started singing to the tune of a song she'd learned in the movement. We are not afraid. And others joined her. We are not afraid. And still others. We are not afraid today. And eventually, more and more joined in, so that these supposedly powerful, armed men had to ask children to stop singing so loudly. A group of brave teenagers can bend the arc of the moral universe. The light shines in the darkness, both cosmically and granularly, at our weddings and our movie screenings, in our families, our schools, and our churches. And thus, a new verse was born. So I have a recording of Pete Seeger singing this song live that I love, and it has truly sustained me for the past few months. In it, he gives this verse, the best verse, he calls it, its own introduction. He says, "Now you and I, like every human being on this earth, we have been afraid. But you still sing it. You still sing it," he says. "We are not afraid. We are not afraid." It would be a lie for me to sing, "I am not afraid." I am. Like Pete said, you and I and everyone else on earth, we've all known fear. Perhaps we know it especially well in this moment in our country and in our world. In our Wednesday night programs this fall, talking about healthy communication in conflict, we talked about how under the surface of so many of our conflicts is fear held in common. We might disagree about just about everything, but we share that we are scared for our children, of our changing world, of feeling helpless against forces beyond us. So yes, I am afraid. I imagine you might be afraid too. Perhaps you see tomorrow's inauguration and the direction this country is going as a potential healing balm to those fears. For others, it greatly exacerbates their fears. The point is that there's fear saturating all sides, driving how we act and interact with each other. But over and over again, the scriptures tell us, fear not. Do not be afraid. Perhaps when we work through that common fear together, perhaps then we find new paths to seeing the dignity of all people, to peace, to beloved community, to how we overcome and we shall. because we learn to act out of love, not fear. And so this is the sign I hope for, that when we sing this together in a few moments, I am afraid, is miraculously converted in our singing and our togetherness to we are not afraid, like water to wine. Because we believe that the light overcomes the darkness, and that that light is revealed in places like this church, in this moment, in our everyday lives, and that we are part of the story of that long moral arc that we shall overcome someday. And so we still sing it. From God, through God, to God are all things. To God be glory forever. Amen.